Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurum ishvaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Natha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomuda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murtnani Patyakshito. Nama Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripakrite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Vairagya Yug Bhakti Rasam Prayatnai Rabhayayam Mam Anubhipsu Mandam Kripam Budirya Paraduka Duki Sanatanam Tam Prabhumashrayami Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Durdantamutsvanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatu Parapadme Ya Bhakti Nikilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandati Shaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramana Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Braja Lokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, Shri Sanatana Gosvamipada. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa. So as we began last time, this brief mini section on Saranagati in Hari-bhakti-vilasa as a subpart of our discussion of sadhana bhakti in the Caitanya-caritamrta and as a prelude to the section about Saranagati in that chapter in Caitanya-caritamrta, we look here at Sanatana Goswami's treatment of the subject of Saranagati. So in our last reading, we started off with one of the most important points in the whole discussion, which is partially inferred from context and partially stated directly by Sri Sanatana Pad, that Saranagati is something practicable by those who can't practice anything else. Those who are unable to perform Navavidha Bhakti and other forms of Bhakti as were described earlier in the text, hearing, chanting, remembering, worshipping, and so on, that for them there is still Saranagati. And Sanatana Pad defined it with this phrase, Kevalam Bhagavadiyo Yam Iti Etavan Matram. That just this much, only Bhagavadiyo Aham. I am Bhagavan's. I belong to Bhagavan. To conceive of oneself as belonging to him and to take shelter in him with this understanding, this is Saranagati. So we looked at the injunctions to perform Sharanagati given by none other than Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the Uddhava Gita as well as the Bhagavad Gita. And we looked at statements covering its what's called nityata, or its compulsoriness. And the argument was given by way of what's called vyatirek, by negating the prospect, or negating any potential for prospect without Sharanagati. So because one will end up perpetually enmeshed in samsara, perpetually devoid of fulfillment without Sharanagati, Sharanagati is essential. So we covered these points, and then we came to the beginning of the longest section in this prakaran, that of the Mahatmya, or the greatness of Sharanagati. So today we'll continue with a number of verses cited from various different Puranas, which highlight the greatness of Sharanagati, or in other words, the various benefits that one attains by taking to it, the various powers and effects that it has. So I'll start from verse 9 here in this prakaran, which is verse 655 in the 11th chapter of the text. So, Namaparad Prasange Padme Sri Naradam Prati Sri Sanat Kumarena, described also by Sri Sanat Kumar to Sri Narada in Padma Puran in regard to offences to the name of Sri Bhagavan. So there's a very important chapter in the in the Padma Puran, which is the chapter where the 10 offences to Harinam are discussed, which were cited here in Hari-bhakti-vilasa, which are cited also in Bhakti Sandarbha, which are alluded to in the Sindhu, and so forth. So, in this very same chapter, where Sanat Kumar is speaking to Sri Narada about the power of the name as well as the consequences of offences to the name, then this statement is made. So, and as will also come up in reference to another verse that will come ahead, what essentially can be drawn out from the discussion of the greatness of the name in that section of the Padma Puran is that Sharanagati is essential to successfully chanting the name. And if one has Sharanagati, one will be successful even if one has so many other general disqualifications. So those are mentioned here in this verse. Sarvachara vivarjita shatadiyo vratya jagat vanchaka damba hankritipana paishuna para papantyaja nishtura ye chanye dhanadhara putra nirata sarva dhamastepihi Shri Govinda pararavinda sharana mukta bhavanti dvija. Even they who are utterly devoid of all proper conduct, possessed of a deceitful mind, uncultured, cheaters of the world, given to arrogance, egotism, drinking, and backbiting, sinners, outcasts, cruel, severely attached to wealth, wife, and son, or the lowest in comparison to all, upon taking shelter in the lotus feet of Sri Govinda, become liberated, O twice born. In other words, O Narada. So, calling out, speaking to him by name at the very end, as though to press the point. In other words, you got that, Narada? You heard right? So, Sanatana Pad offers a few clarifications of some of the characteristics mentioned here. So, Vratya, Sangskarahina Dvijadhama, the uncultured, or Vratya, refers to those who are devoid of samskaras. That is, good upbringing, education, purity, ritual sanctification, and refinement, and so on. That is, lowly twice-borns. So here he says dvijas, but this is a little bit of a peculiarity of conventional usage, if you will, because to become a Dvija, you require the Upanayan Samskar. So if you have no Samskaras, how are you a Dvija? You wouldn't be. Nevertheless, there's not a fault in this statement, because the term Dvija, although it literally refers to the twice-born, or those who've received the Upanayan Samskar, it also is conventionally used, and you'll find it mentioned in koshas and dictionaries, as a term that collectively refers to the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya Varnas, because those are the three Varnas that are eligible to receive the Upanayan Samskar. So although just by being born in the Varna, you're not twice born, you're just once born, nevertheless, those persons once born into those Varnas are still called Dvijas, or twice-borns, because they're the people who are eligible to become twice-born, and who, in most cases, by the age of 8 or 12 or 16 or what have you, do become so. So therefore, to describe Dvijas as Samskarahina is not a contradiction or not a fault, even though it can appear to be, a contradiction. So essentially what he means is people who are born into the upper three Varnas, but who don't receive the samskaras that are meant for the people in those Varnas. So what are sometimes called Brahmabandhus or Kshatrabandhus, in other words, the relatives of Brahmins or the relatives of Kshatriyas, means persons who are born into those families, born into those castes, but who haven't been given the education and the samskaras that are meant for such persons. So that's what he's referring to here. And he draws this out also because of the way he defines the term papa, coming up in a second. But we'll get to that in a minute. Panam apeyasya. So drinking refers to substances that are forbidden to be drunk. So, just as drinking and driving doesn't mean you can't drink water while you drive your car, drinking and driving means drinking alcohol. So similarly in the Bhagavad and many of the Puranas, this, references to drinking are just like they are in English, where drinking implies drinking something that's intoxicating or forbidden to drink. And as is mentioned elsewhere, surapana, or consumption of alcohol, is considered one of the 5 most prominent types of patakas, or causes of degradation, or what are conventionally considered sins. So here he's speaking of someone who is panapara, or given to drinking. In other words, someone who regularly consumes alcohol or other intoxicants. So the compound papantyaja refers to those who are sinners, that is, adharmic shudras and outcasts. Alternately, the meaning of papantyaja is they who are sinners even among the outcasts. So take it either way you prefer. But in any case, he's covering the 4 varnas here by saying that the term papa refers to the shudras, and the implication being that the dvijas refer to the other members of the varnas. The members of the other varnas. The compound sarvadhama refers to those who are the lowest in comparison to all, that is, the lowest in all respects. So, regardless of whether you consume intoxicants, regardless of whether you're a vegetarian, regardless of whether you, maintain, celibate conduct or, what have you, whatever your condition may be, there's no amount of sin, no amount of wrongdoing, no amount of unfavorable conditioning that the power of Bhagavan Sarup Shakti, the power that flows through acts of bhakti like Saranagati, cannot purify. This is, of course, an idealistic, principled statement, but nevertheless an important and hopeful one to understand. That you can never be as bad as bhakti and Bhagavan can be good. You can never contaminate yourself to an extent that's beyond what the power of bhakti, the power of Bhagavan has to purify you. So, whatever condition one may be in, Shri Govinda Pararavinda Sharana, if someone becomes a Sharanagata of the lotus feet of Govinda, they become liberated, the implication being purified and freed from the consequences of such entangling activity. So the idea here then is that Saranagati is supremely purifying. So if we think of how Jiva Goswami spoke in the Priti Sandarbha, in the first Anucheda, with this very significant statement, jivasya doshamulam hi paratattva jnana bhava, that the fundamental defect of every jiva in samsara, which is the cause of their suffering, is the absence of awareness of the Paramatattva, the absence of awareness of Bhagavan. And if Saranagati, as Sanatana Pad has defined it here, is Bhagavadiyo Hum, that I am Bhagavan's, that implies that the person has Paratattva Gyan, that they have awareness of Bhagavan, and not only awareness of Bhagavan or Unmukata or Sammukya towards Bhagavan, but they have the sense that they belong to Bhagavan, that they are for Bhagavan, that they are under the protection of Bhagavan. So, because they are free from that fundamental defect, which is the cause of all detriment, the cause of all entanglement, then they're said here to be liberated. And the implication being that they're now in the track, they're in the lane, they're on the way, so to speak. And because there is the very real potential for the completeness of that liberation to be realized, then they're fit to be described as liberated or effectively liberated. Just as someone might say, I'm going to India when they're at the airport about to board the plane. They haven't actually got on the plane, they're not actually flying to India yet, but they're going to India. Just as we say that because it's inevitably going to happen very soon, just similarly the Shastra speaks in this way, saying that those who are sheltered in Bhagavan are liberated. And there are other ways of reading it, but this is one particular way which I think is appropriate in this context. So, what is the Mahatma here? That Saranagati can purify you of anything. That Saranagati is so applicable, is ultimately so effective and significant, that no matter what kind of business you've been up to, there's hope for you, and there's the potential for you to be purified. And furthermore, this also shows the Mahatma of Bhagavan, that he's not put off by any of this. In other words, if he wouldn't accept even the people who are described in this verse as his own, as those who take shelter in him, then this statement would never be made. So the implication is that you can have no conduct. In other words, you can eat whatever you eat, you can be born in whatever caste you're born, you can be mean, cruel, misbehaved, drunk, proud, arrogant, whatever. But none of that puts Bhagavan off. None of that is going to stop someone, rather going to stop Bhagavan from accepting that person when, as we discussed in the previous class, they say, Tavasmiti, just once. They say, I am yours, or here, as Sanatana put it, I am Bhagavan's. By just saying this once, whatever their condition may be, that's enough for Bhagavan. He doesn't see these things as a bar to entry. So in our social customs, we have all kinds of rules and filters, and we want to avoid so many things, and in many cases it's necessary to some extent, so to speak, segregate persons of certain behaviors for the well-being and the dignity and the upkeep of healthy conduct among those who are free from that. It's not that there isn't a place for that, but nevertheless that these divisions or even senses of hierarchy that we may sustain in society ought not be projected onto Bhagavan, or it's not that Bhagavan necessarily needs to consider things in the same way, or rather that he ever has or does. For him, whatever material conditioning there is, nothing of any great impediment to his power and capability. So all of these points, all of this we can draw from this statement. So moving on, I don't want to elaborate too much, otherwise we'll spend too long on this section. I don't want to belabor it too much. So, Brahma-vaivarta. In the Brahma-vaivarta Puran, we find the following. Nahi narayanam nama, nara sangsritya shonaka, prapnuvantya shubha satyamidam uktam puna puna. O Shonaka, indeed by taking shelter fully in Narayan, human beings certainly do not undergo inauspiciousness. I avow this statement again and again. So I'll just come to the commentary. He shabdo vadharane. The word certainly, or he, is in the sense of affirmation. Ashubham amangalam anishtam va kinchit naiva prapnuvanti. Kintu sarva shreya eva labante iti artaha. Human beings certainly do not undergo any inauspiciousness, that is misfortune or detriment, and rather verily attain all good fortune. This is the meaning. So as Krishna said to Arjuna in the verse of the Gita we discussed last time, Ma shucha, don't fear, or don't grieve, don't worry, because when you're with me, nothing can go wrong. Similarly, Krishna told Uddhava, Mayasya hya kuto bhaya, be free from fear from all quarters. In other words, when you're with me, when you have my support, when you depend on me, then nothing can harm you. You need not harbor any misgivings or any doubt about my capability to bring about your well-being or my intentness upon your well-being. So, thus, when this statement here says that one who takes shelter in Narayan do not undergo any inauspiciousness, then the meaning is, here Sanatana is saying, that rather they attain all auspiciousness, or all good things, all well-being certainly comes to them. So when you take shelter in the embodiment, the essence of good, then what do you end up with? Goodness, and nothing else. Nama prakashye, yadva narayanam iti nama shritya, tatascha nama mahatmye, shlokoyam, drashtabyam. So now Sanatana gives a double meaning of the word nama in the verse. So first of all, he says, the word, quote, indeed, nama, is in the sense of being well known. That is, it indicates something that is well known to be true. Or alternately, the word nama means name, and in this case refers to the name Narayan. In this case, furthermore, the verse is to be seen in regard to the greatness of the name of Bhagavan. So, the word nama, in Sanskrit, is very similar, appears to be, in all likelihood, cognate with the word name in English. So, nama can mean name. So, Narayanam nama. This can be interpreted as the two words in opposition in the same case, and then that apposition can be interpreted as a possessive relationship. So it can be taken as the name Narayan. Or, sorry, not a possessive relationship, but like a dual compound, similar, like an equivalence relationship. So taking shelter in the name Narayan. Or, conventionally, the word nama also is used as an intensifier in speech. You'll see it oftentimes in tikas more commonly than you see it in verses, but you will occasionally see it in verses, where the word nama is just used to emphasize a particular word or stress a particular point, and it doesn't convey any sense of name there, but simply conveys that something is well known or something is to be taken attentively or something like this. So that's how Sanatana gives the first interpretation, that Nahi Narayana Nama. In other words, taking shelter in Narayan, like sort of stressing this point, specifically in Narayan or in Narayan, who is so well known or, so well considered to be worthy of shelter. It can be interpreted in that general way as a reference to what he calls prakashya, or something that is, in other words, a reference to what the speaker is assuming is already known to the reader, or what is common knowledge, so to speak. Or, as we mentioned before, it can also be interpreted to mean name, and then it can become considered also the object of this samashrita, and then mean the name Narayan. So then he says that if you interpret it to mean name, then this verse can also be interpreted as a statement in praise of the greatness of the name, not just in praise of the greatness of Saranagati. So this is his point, that you can categorize it in both ways, both interpretations are acceptable. And he adds, Yadva namashrayanam api bhagavarashrayanam eva iti tayor abhed abhiprayina. Alternately, taking shelter in the name too is verily taking shelter in Bhagavan. Thus, this verse is spoken and cited here with the intended sense of non-difference between them. That is, between taking shelter in the name of Sri Bhagavan and taking shelter in Sri Bhagavan himself. So, I think this is self-evident. If you interpret it as to mean taking shelter in the name, then by inclusion in this section about Saranagati, the implication becomes that taking shelter in the name is taking shelter in Bhagavan, which would imply that the name is non-different than Bhagavan, and taking shelter in the name is non-different than taking shelter in Bhagavan. So, this is how he reads it. So, broadly speaking, apart from this matter of the name, what the verse is emphasizing in terms of the prakaran, in terms of drawing out the Mahatma of Saranagati, is that one who takes to Saranagati will never end up worse off for doing so. If you invest in the stock market, you might make money, you might lose all your money. If you go buy food at the supermarket, you'll probably be fine, but you might end up eating something that's contaminated or cancerous. Who knows? But if you take shelter in Bhagavan, there's nothing to worry about. Anything in this perceivable world, as trustworthy as it might be, it's not 100% guaranteed to work out for you. But taking shelter in Bhagavan, never will there be any inauspiciousness because of that. So here, I avow this. Idam satyam uktam puna. Puna. It's like a emphatic sort of statement. Again and again, I'm saying the truth to you. You will never undergo auspiciousness. You will never be worse off by taking shelter in Bhagavan, or by taking shelter in his name. So you're guaranteed a good result. You're guaranteed benefit, safety, shelter, support, well-being, etc. And this same theme will come up again in later verses in this section. So, Brihad Naradiye Kali Prasange, in the Brihad Naradiya Puran, in regard to Kali. Paramartam asheshasya jagatam adhikaranam sharanyam sharanam yatu govindam navasidati. One who has taken shelter in the supreme object, the original cause of the entire universe, the supreme shelterer, Govinda, does not despond. Na avasidati. So just a brief comment. Paramarta paramafalarupam paramatattvam va. Quote, the supreme object, or paramarta, refers to he whose form is the supreme attainment. Or it refers to he who is the supreme entity, paramatattva. So you could also call that ultimate reality, or the absolute truth, or the supreme being, or whatever language you like. What his point is that Saranagati refers to perception of, awareness of, connection with absolute reality, the all-pervading eternal, the all-pervading source, wholesome, goodness that, is further understood to have the specific nature of being Govinda, but in general is understood as the ultimate shelterer of all, the ultimate cause of all, the ultimate object or ultimate thing that one could ever experience or, so to speak, attain. So when one takes shelter in that absolute reality, in that original cause, in that supreme shelter, then one does not despond. So he says, Nava Navasidati kinchit dukam napnoti. Does not despond means does not undergo any misery. So the idea is it'll never result in your detriment to do this. In other words, that supreme object, that supreme shelterer, that supreme source is good, supremely good, supremely capable and replete with everything that is in your very highest interest. So insofar as you take shelter in him, insofar as you become aware of him, insofar as you live with and through and for and of and by him, then all causes of sorrow, all causes of entanglement, all causes of wrongdoing, etc., become distanced, going on out to the point of disintegrated, evaporated. So you'll never be sorry that you did so. It'll never result in something that will in the future cause suffering. So if you take shelter in, a king, then you might initially get the benefit of some, support or protection, but then when that king exploits his subjects or gets conquered by another king, and then, whatever one relationship had with that king is then lost, then, you might end up desponding for, suffering because of having taken shelter in someone who offered you shelter. But if you take shelter in Govinda, then you'll never end up desponding. He's never going to get overthrown, and he's never going to exploit you, etc., etc. Shanti Parvani Rajadharme Bhishma Yudhishthira Sangvade. In the Shanti Parva of Mahabharata, in the conversation of Bhishma and Yudhishthir in regard to the dharma of a king. Stita priyahite nityam ya eva purusharshabha rajangscha tavayadu shresto vaikunta purushottama yainam sangshrayantya yantiha bhaktya narayanam harim te tarantya ha durgani nametrasti vicharana. O king, those in this world who with bhakti take shelter fully in he who is ever intent upon your pleasure and well-being, the greatest of the Purushas, the foremost of the Yadus, the unbluntable one, the supreme Purusha, Narayana, Hari, cross over all difficulties in this world. I have no doubt about this. So this is Bhishma speaking to Yudhishthir of Krishna or of Govinda. So Govinda is he who is ever intent upon your pleasure and well-being. In other words, Krishna went to such great extent to see to the welfare and the satisfaction of the Pandavas. So anyone who takes shelter in him will cross over all difficulties in the world. So a few comments from Sri Sanatana. Tava priye hite cha nityam stita avastitaha. Ever intent upon your pleasure and well-being means ever resolved or present or engaged for the sake of that. So Krishna is described as tad bhakta bhaktiman, he who has bhakti for his bhaktas, he whose only job, so to speak, is fulfilling the desires of his bhaktas. So he's ever intent to see to their welfare and their pleasure. And what is his capability to do that? then these other qualifiers indicate that. Purusheshu brahmadishu trishu madhye tebhyo va rishabha shreshta avatari tvat. So, quote, the greatest of the Purushas means the greatest among the three Purushas, namely Brahma and so forth, that is Vishnu and Shiva, or the greatest even in comparison to them, on account of Sri Krishna's being the source of all avatars. That is, Sri Krishna is superior to Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva because they are avatars and he is their source, the avatari. Ato Vaikunta, Akunta Prabhava. So thus, Sri Krishna is, quote, the unbluntable one, or Vaikunta. That is, he who is of unblunted might. Or you can take it as splendor, glory, or what have you. So, kunt, this root in Sanskrit, refers to something blunt, or something, flat and hard. So Vikunta or Vaikunta, which is without that. So the idea is that Vaikunta is all pervading. It's, so to speak, sharp, such that it can pervade the totality of reality. It's unblunted, or nothing can check its all-pervasive greatness. So Akunta Prabhav, that its power is unchecked or unstopped in any way. So if you take it in reference to the domain. Now here, the name Vaikuntha is not referring to the domain Vaikuntha, but rather is also a name of Bhagavan. So you'll find this repeatedly in the Bhagavatam and elsewhere. So when Vaikuntha is the name of Bhagavan, then it means he who's never blunted. In other words, whose power, whose glory, and you could also say pervasiveness, since Bhagavan is also all-pervading, is never checked or blunted by anything. So that which is, in other words, supremely, superior in potency or capability in comparison to all. So because he's taking here as a line of causal implication. So if he's Purusharshobha, or he's the supreme among the Purushas, then he's Vaikunta, because who would be able to check his power? Some great Purusha, like Shiva or Brahma. But because neither Shiva nor Brahma, nor, according to the second interpretation, even Vishnu, can check or blunt his power, then he is Vaikunta. So because he's superior to all other Purushas, the implication is that he's Vaikunta. Kimcha Purushottama, Yasmak Sharam Matitoham Aksharad Apichottamam, Iti Adi Ukta Lakshana. So furthermore, Sri Krishna is, quote, the supreme Purusha, or Purushottam, that is, possessed of the characteristics stated in Bhagavad Gita 15:18, since I am beyond the perishable, all unconscious entities, and superior even to the imperishable, that is, all other conscious entities, I am renowned in the world and the Vedas as the supreme Purusha. So this is how Shamipada interprets that Gita verse. Sanatana doesn't interpret the Gita verse here, he just quotes it. So the word Shara there is a little bit cryptic, so different commentators have read it in different ways. Shamipada reads it as I've translated here. Chakravartipad takes it rather to say that the Kshara refers to Jivas, and the Akshara refers to Paramatma, which would be Vishnu. So then to say that Bhagavan is this Purushottama would mean that he's what Jiva Goswami refers to as the Bhagavat aspect of the Paratattva, which is superior even to the Paramatma aspect. So that interpretation of Vishwanath Chakravartipad would also match with the alternate interpretation that Sanatana Goswamipad gives here. So you could take it either way. Otev Narayanam Sarva Jivaik Ashrayam Harim Cha Ashrayanam Matrena Sarva Dosha Dukkha Haram Manoharam Cha. So therefore, Sri Krishna is Narayana, that is the sole shelter of all jivas. So Narayana, the term Nara can refer to a living being, can be interpreted to mean a jiva, and the word Ayana can mean a refuge or a dwelling place. So Narayana can mean the dwelling place or the refuge of living beings. So Sanatana Pad here is interpreting the word Narayan as Sarva Jiva Ikashraya, or the ultimate or the singular shelter of all jivas. So when he's reading it that way, the interpretation of Samipad of the previous Gita verse fits with that. So that's why I footnoted and gave both, because one matches a bit the earlier way and the other matches the later sense. So because he's superior to the Kshara and the Akshara, he's superior to all jivas as the most powerful of all Purushas of unchecked, influence. He is the one ultimate shelter of all living beings. He's Narayana. And moreover, he is Hari as that shelter, and with that power, what does he do? He does Sarva Dosha Dukkha Hara. He takes away all the defects and all the suffering of everyone, or faults and miseries, however you want to consider it. But when does he do so? Ashrayana Matrena, just when the person takes shelter in him. So notably, that also means that he doesn't do that when they don't. In other words, there is suffering in the world. There are people in the world who are not seeking shelter in Bhagavan and thus continue to perpetually suffer from their various defects, or which, as we discussed earlier, the root of all of them being the absence of awareness of the Paratattva. But just by taking shelter in him, in other words, just by negating that root of the cause that is the cause of all defects, then he graciously comes forward, enters the awareness of that person, and brings about their well-being, such that they can become free from all suffering and all faults. Principally by giving the association of his bhaktas, giving knowledge of the path of bhakti to him, and so forth, whereby someone can learn what are their own defects, distinguish themselves from defects, recognize where their areas of work lie, and take to the practice of sadhana with trust and faith in the shelter of Bhagavan, in the purifying grace of Bhagavan, the purifying power of bhakti to him, and whereby one can ultimately become freed from all such suffering and defects. So all of that is encapsulated in saying that Krishna is, or, he who saw to the Pandavas' well-being, who Yudhishthira is being told about by Bhishma, meaning Krishna, is Hari, or he is he who removes all the defects and thereby the suffering of everyone. And moreover, Manohara, and he also captivates their minds. In other words, this implies rasa, this implies beauty, this implies charm, love, and all other further degrees of enrichment. So there's also a rendering of the name Hari. Here, Manohar, Dukkahar, these are both drawing out of the Hri Dhatu that the name Hari is derived from. So there's also a similar explanation of the name Hari in the Caritamrta, I think in the Atmarama verse discussion, Itam Bhutaguno Hari, because the last word there is Hari. And there it's given that he takes away all the sin of everyone, and he captivates their mind by prema, or by giving them prema, by giving them the experience of prema for himself. In that way, he effects this captivation of their mind. So that would be a further import of Sanatana Pad's statement here, that Hari means Manohara. And finally, Durgani Dustara Sangsara Dukkani. Difficulties refers to the difficult to overcome miseries of samsara. So Bhishma Dev's statement here is that someone will cross over all those difficulties in the world which seem impossible to ever overcome when someone takes shelter with bhakti in Krishna, who has such capability to bring about that transcendence of those difficulties by virtue of him having the qualities that are implied by all of the qualifiers with which he's described in this verse. So, as far as the Mahatma is to be derived, then one can understand that Bhagavan is the ultimate aspect of the ontological spiritual reality, and that he is replete with all capability, and that capability works in favor of the Sharanagata by virtue of the person taking shelter in Bhagavan. So, Kevalam Bhagavadiyo Ham. Again, let's come back to the central thread of the whole thing. I belong to Bhagavan. Just by having that awareness, what happens? The whole of Bhagavan's own potency starts to work in your favor. Or you come in sync with that ultimate source, that ultimate power, that ultimate reality and existence. You come into alignment with it by remaining oblivious of it, by acting contrary to it. Then one actually, it's the same power, but one's rubbing up against it, against the grain, so to speak, such that it perpetually results in instability and transience and varieties of suffering and so forth. But when one comes in sync with it, when one sees that one belongs to it, one doesn't try to use it for oneself, but rather seeks to be a vessel of its own glorious expression, then one finds oneself free from suffering, free from defects, replete with all virtues and qualities, and in the midst of wonderful company, engaged in wonderful activities with a sense of richness for the very existence of oneself and life and every opportunity one has to engage as a Sharanagata in bhakti to him. So Bhishma Dev, one of the 12 Mahajans who has experience of this, therefore says, Name trasti vicharana. I have no doubt about this. In other words, I have experience of how wonderful this is. All right. Tritiya Skande Vidura Maitreya Sangvade. In the third canto, in the conversation of Vidura and Maitreya. Sharira manasa dibya vayase yecha manushaha. Bhotikascha katam klesha badante harisang shrayam. O son of Vyasa, how can afflictions arising by means of the body, the mind, the firmament, human beings, or the elements trouble one who is fully sheltered in Hari? How can they? They can't. This is the import. So just a few categorical points here. Dibya antariksha, quote, arising by means of the firmament, or dibya, means arising by means of the sky, that is, through astrological influences. So the word dibya is also cognate with the English word divine. Often the word dibya is thought of as something desirable, something pleasurable or wonderful, but the word dibya actually, although derives from the root dew or div, which refers to the sky, it would perhaps more literally be translated as celestial, just as we think of something celestial as something of the heavens or the skies. The word dibya has that sort of root. So antariksha conveys that, clarifies that that's the sense here. In other words, when he's talking about afflictions coming up, then it's not that afflictions can come from something divine. So he's clarifying then that when it's saying that these afflictions are, quote, dibya, that source of the afflictions just simply means from the astrological circumstances, not from something that would be called, quote, divine. Then manusha shatru prabhaha, arising by means of humans or human beings, refers to that the cause of which is enemies. So not all human beings cause trouble, but those who are inimical to oneself. Bhotika shitoshnadi prabhavaha.
Recording in progress.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it looked like the line dropped there for a minute. I'm not sure why. I don't know if that was on my end or the other end. Anyway, I'm just continuing here in the comments. So, Bhotika Shitoshnadi Prabhavaha. Arising by means of the elements refers to those the cause of which is cold, heat, and so on. So, alternately, he gives a second way of categorizing these points. Yadva Sharira Manasas Cheti Adhyatmika Dibya Adidaivika Manusha Anya Bhotikas Cheti Adibhotika Iti Trivida Api Tapaha. So alternately you can read these to fit into the common categories known as the treetop jala or the threefold miseries. So he says, arising by means of the body and arising by means of the mind refers to those arising by means of the self, adhyatmika. Arising by means of the firmament, divya, refers to those arising by means of destiny, or the devas, adidaivika. And arising by means of human beings refers to those arising by means of other entities. In this way, sufferings within samsara are also of three types. Vayase he vidura, quote, O son of Vyas, refers to Vidura. So, in the beginning of the Bhagavatam, we hear this phrase, Tapa Trayon Mulanam, that this supreme dharma uproots the three miseries. So similarly here, it's saying, how can afflictions arising by these three means and subcategories thereof trouble one who is fully sheltered in Hari? So does this mean that one will never feel cold during a winter storm? Some parts of the world right now are going through some heavy winter times. So does that mean no bhakta ever feels cold? Not quite. It means that one might still experience some of the extremes of the circumstances of worldly life, but that one is not entangled in that, or that is not happening merely as a result of karma, merely as a cause of affliction. A bhakta is either experiencing that because Bhagavan deems it the best for the development of their bhakti, or because a bhakta is taking pleasure in rendering service to Bhagavan in the midst of such obstacles. In other words, just as athletes or something like that sometimes take pleasure in overcoming some, being double teamed in a match and scoring a point or something, then the fact that they got double teamed makes their success all the more relishable. So similarly, bhaktas may take on certain austerities as welcome challenges to further express their enthusiasm to serve Bhagavan. So whatever the case may be, it's not that persons who take shelter in Bhagavan merely suffer in the afflictions of worldly life just as common people do. And as per the interpretation I also mentioned earlier, it can also be taken in the sense of terminality, that if one has taken shelter in Bhagavan, then very soon, in an inevitable, soon-to-pass period, one will transcend all such things. It can also be seen in that way. All right, and well, maybe I'll leave it at that for today. And we have more similar Mahatmya Katha coming in the verses, a few other from various Puranas, a few more from the Bhagavatam. So I'll let it stop here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback of any type, please feel free to share.
Pranam Krishna Sharana.
Pranam.
Hari-bhakti. Oh, you hear me. So, as ever, when the Mahatmya of an aspect of bhakti is proclaimed, is there any counterpart that can prevent Saranagati to be attained? I don't know if I'm clear. More specifically, Saranagati is something that definitely is very glorious. But is there any possibility that it cannot be attained by the special consciousness or act of the one who wants attained.
Yeah, there is. And one way it can be seen, there's a couple of verses from the Bhagavatam that are cited in this regard by Gosvamipada in the Bhakti-sandarbha, spoken in reference to Gajendra, and Gajendra's taking shelter in Bhagavan. Gajendra is discussed repeatedly in the Bhagavad and by the Goswamis in their works as the prime example of a Sharanagata. He who simply said, Saeva mama sharanam, that he alone is my shelter, and just by taking shelter in Bhagavan, Bhagavan protected him. So, there, in that regard, in the third canto, there's this statement which says, Tameva sukaradyam rijubhir ananya sharaner nribi ko no sevate duraradyam asadhubi, I believe is the phrase, which says that who would not worship Bhagavan? And what is the characteristic of Bhagavan? His characteristic is twofold. He's sukaradyam, or he's very easy to worship, or happily worshipable, by people who have two characteristics. One, as per our discussion here, ananya sharana, who's have no other shelter. In other words, he is easily worshipable by Sharanagatas. But then it is also said, rijubi, by those persons who have no other shelter and are straight, or in other words, who are sincere, or not kutil or kapat, deceitful or duplicitous in their Sharanagati. So just as in the world, a classic Indian example would be a minister who, quote unquote, surrenders to a king and assists a king in all of his affairs, but then plots a coup and, supports someone else to become the king or vies to take over the throne himself. So he's a Sharanagata, but he's not Riju. He's not sincere in his act as a Sharanagata. So similarly, if we say, Kevalam Bhagavadiyo Ham, only I am yours, but then we actually don't live that way, we actually don't think that way, we actually act contrary to that, then the depth or the richness or the potential of one's being a Sharanagata is not there, or it's lacking. So, as Sanatana Pad said, Sharanagati is quote unquote easy, or it's easier than doing any of these other activities. The Nama Kirtan is highly praised as being so easy. All you have to do is move your lips. People don't want to work, they don't want to do this, they don't want to, take a bath in the cold weather and clean everything and then do this elaborate ritual to worship the deity. Okay, you don't even have to do that. You can just sit tight, wrap yourself up in a chadar, stay warm on your asan. All you have to do is move your lips and chant. There's some statements in the Puranas that praise the name like this. So taking a Kaimutya Nyaya, we can say, and to be a Sharanagata, you don't even have to move your lips. In other words, you can just sit there and think, you could just sit there and say, just even this contemplation, even holding this conviction that I belong to Bhagavan, that'll get you into Sharanagati. But, the kicker is, but if that's not actually sincere, if you then go about duplicity doing various other things, then that Sharanagati is not Sharanagati as it's meant to be. So, Jiva Goswami, also in the section on Shraddha in the Bhakti-sandarbha, he explains that Sharanagati is the linga or the indicator of Shraddha. So as to the strength of your Shraddha, so shall be your Sharanagati. So therefore, to be a Sharanagata requires Shraddha. And when you have Shraddha, in Jiva Goswami's viewpoint, Shraddha is correlated with, and not only correlated, but causative of conduct that matches the conviction that one has. So today we talked about this verse that says, even if you're uncultured and a sinner and a drinker and all this, if you're a Sharanagata, you'll become a Mukta. But this doesn't mean that you can become a Sharanagata and then you just carry on with all of that. The implication is that somebody was all of those things, and then in taking shelter in Bhagavan, then what did they do? Anukulyasya sankalpa pratikulya vivarjanam. The two angas of Sharanagati that will come later in this prakaran. Then they're required to have a resolve to do only what is favorable for belonging to Bhagavan, and to reject what is unfavorable. So if you say, I'm a Sharanagata, but then you go and do so many things that are harmful to other people or harmful to yourself or disrespectful to Bhagavan, then, what Sharanagati do you have? So the idea is that Sharanagati is easy in the sense that it doesn't require any type of ritualization of any kind. But the reality is that most people, to perform a ritual or sing, that's actually not that difficult. But to genuinely, sincerely have this conviction at heart and be sincere in one's living it out, that's really where most people are stuck. And it's not that Sharanagati is something that, so to speak, frees you or gives you a get out of, a skip card or an alibi for that, so to speak. It's, it nevertheless requires that someone be sincere, or what in that verse of Kapila Dev, Riju, sincere. So for those who are sincere and who have Sharanagati, Bhagavan is very easy to worship. He's Sukaradyam. No problem. So in short, yes, the thing that will determine the strength of one's Sharanagati is the depth of one's adherence to the limbs of Sharanagati, which is something that will come at the end of the prakaran. After this discussion of the Mahatmya, then we get to the lakshanas, or the characteristics of being a Sharanagata. So this topic will be elaborated on in further detail then. This is a preview or an overview of that, if I may. So does that answer your query?
Yes, Babaji, perfect. Can we say also that actually the Sharanagati can be seen as a parallel with Apichet verse?
Yes and no. As per Jiva Goswami's interpretations, in one place in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he says that the person spoken of in this verse, Abhishet Shudarataro, does not have Shastriya Shraddha. Because if they did, they wouldn't do any Durachar. So he says that therefore the person there is not he refers to them as the non-primary adhikari among the Kanishtas. Or in other words, he doesn't accept them as an adhikari of the Shastriya Bhakti, which is the principal path that he's laying out on the basis of the Bhagavatam. But that they have some form of Lokik Shraddha. And so if we take Sharanagati in the sense that Jiva Goswami lays it out as the indicator or the outcome of Shraddha, and we understand that for Jiva Goswami and therefore Sanatana Goswami, Rupa Goswami, Shraddha is Shastriya Shraddha, then in that sense we'll see a distinction and say that not quite, so to speak. But at the same time, broadly speaking, there are also places where Jiva Goswami does cite this verse, and other commentators do cite this verse, to refer to someone who does have some type of Shraddha in Bhagavan, and they're meritorious because they don't worship a devata other than him. They are Ananya Bhak. So, as per the lakshanas that we'll get to later, we can see that that sort of falls on the fault, where they have some of the lakshanas, but not all of the lakshanas of what is laid out to be a Sharanagata in this prakaran. So in that way, it's a yes and a no, so to speak, as the way I understand it. Trying to assemble the different ways that the verse is cited in different places together.
Yes, Babaji. But in another end, it seems that the Sharanagati is like Bhakti is kind of independent and doesn't depend of anything. But also it is said that we should have Shraddha. But Shraddha is coming from Shastriya Shraddha. So it seems also that Sharanagati will depend on Shastra, on the Shastra, on the Shraddha of the Shastra. So how can we resolve that Sharanagati will be independent and at the same time depend of the Shraddha?
Well, I think, as I was trying to explain, Sharanagati in its proper sense is the outcome of Shastriya Shraddha. So if we look at it in that conservative sense, if someone doesn't have Shastriya Shraddha, then they don't meet the definition of a Sharanagata, as per, the viewpoint of Jiva Goswami, let's say. But in a broader sense, someone may not meet that definition, but nevertheless, Jiva Goswami still accepts them as the non-primary adhikari, or the, perhaps we could throw out a category like a pre-adhikari, so to speak. Like they have, first grade, second grade, and then they have preschool, right? So someone who maybe hasn't had the sadhu sangha that you need in order to acquire Shastriya Shraddha, but especially in the Indian context, they definitely may have some kind of Lokik Shraddha based on their upbringing and their cultural experience. And in many cases, people can have, you can say, a strong degree of conviction in that Lokik or that culturally based type of conviction. And that can also inspire a great deal of trust in Bhagavan, or prayer to Bhagavan, or adoration of Bhagavan, in whatever degree of clarity or depth their concept may be. And as we discussed, if Bhagavan is not put off by the fact that you drink and smoke and eat meat and all this kind of stuff, the fact that someone has just never had an education or received a more clear idea about him, but nevertheless, based on what they do understand from their cultural experience, does have conviction in him, he's not, like snobbing his nose up at these people. So, there is the chance that those persons can certainly be benefited, and that can also be instrumental in the process of the person acquiring a bhakti samskar and the person arriving in sadhu sangha that can then consolidate, if you will, or clear and refine their shraddha and their concept such that they'll get something that is solid and sure to lead them to a meaningful and ultimately fulfilling spiritual end. So the process is not always, so to speak, clean and cut and by the book. For some of us who might be from a culture and live in a country where there isn't a prevalent practice of any Indic knowledge systems or, customs of bhakti, then we might be initially exposed more to the theory even before the practice and the cultural engagement of it. Whereas within, the Indian subcontinent, it's usually in the vast majority of cases the other way around, where people already think, bhakti is just what they grew up with. It's just the way their grandparents were busy every morning as when they went off to school. It's just, it takes a while for them to realize that they actually don't know that much about what bhakti is, because from their cultural experience, they already think that they know what it is. And so for people in that context and in that situation to acquire shraddha as it's conceived in a refined manner by our acharyas requires, the right sadhu sangha and the right, samskar to be able to go through that educational process and acquire that kind of refined understanding. So depending on the trajectory that someone is on, there will be different, phases in the process of them reaching that point where they can have the ideal form of shraddha that gives them an ideal form of eligibility for the path. And, we want good for everybody and we want to encourage everyone. So from whatever direction and context people might be coming from, then let them be encouraged, let them try and let them, hopefully, go forward in a way that works out for their well-being.
Yes, thank you, Babaji. But just one last question, because this subject matter is so interesting. Is the Saranagati the best way or the more secure way to attain Priti?
Definitely. I mean, in Jiva Goswami's, you'll find him describing, referring to in the Bhakti Sandarbha when he's starting the sadhana discussion, he, to speak of sadhana, he refers to Saranagati and so on. Not Namakirtan and so on, or Shravana and so on, but Saranagati and so on. Like, for him, it's the fundamental premise of all sadhana. As the famous statement that he makes there, Tadiyatva siddhe, that without Saranagati, Bhagavan will never accept you as a bhakta. So, whatever you do, if you're not, first of all, a Saranagata, then what are you doing? You might be chanting his name, you might be doing an act of bhakti, but just doing an act of bhakti doesn't make you a bhakta in the eyes of Bhagavan. In other words, a bhakta in the sense of someone who's his own, someone who's actually belongs to him, who's what's called tadiya tva asiddhe, that there's no recognition of belonging to him without Saranagati. And no matter what kind of acts of bhakti you do, if you don't do them as someone who's his own, then what are you doing them for? You're doing them for yourself, You're doing them as, what Prahlad Maharaj implied was a business transaction. You're showing some adoration to a powerful person in order to get some benefit for yourself. Jiva Goswami in the Sindhu commentary refers to this as a Swarta Kriya Vishesh, or a particular self-directed practice or process. So, in this sense, to be a Saranagata is essential to doing any type of bhakti sadhana at all. And that's something that we'll get to here in the Caritamrta also, because it's very significant that just now we're coming to the Saranagati Prakaran, and it's only after the Saranagati Prakaran that discussion of sadhana bhakti and detailed sadhana practices starts. And you see the exact same order of description in the Bhakti Sandarbha. Jiva Goswami discusses Saranagati, and then he starts with all these different Navada Bhakti and all the specific ritual practices and so on. So we can see that, and then Sanatana Goswami, what we're reading here, he does it in reverse. He puts Saranagati at the very end, but says, if you can't do any of these, you can still do this. So from all these different perspectives, we get this understanding that Saranagati has this very unique and pivotal role in the process.
So thank you, Babaji. This is so interesting, but I have so many other questions, but I don't want to monopolize it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, maybe next time they'll come up. We can discuss further. Yes, Vidyaji, did you also want to say something?
Yes, Pranam. I have a question actually.
Okay, Pranam.
Pranam. Thank you for the presentation. It's a very, very inspiring lecture to hear these hopeful statements. And what comes to mind is why Saranagati is Guhyatamam, or just such a hidden aspect, not pronounced so strongly. Of course, we have Bhagavatam examples, give an example of Saranagati, Gajendra and Dhruva and others, but I also find it a bit not problematic, but interesting that the different writers, Kartapadas and different Vaishnavas in the past, they dedicated special book to Sharanagati exclusively, as if this is like compulsory. Not, I'm sorry, it's like a supplementary item that we have to talk separately on the side of mainstream discussion on Siddhanta. I find it a little bit not like surprising, because why not Rupa Goswami? I'm just questioning, like, objectively, why Rupa Goswami didn't put this right in the front. Even I mentioned this earlier, that in Bhakti Samhita Sindhu, the list of different angas, the Sharanagati is like halfway through the list. And of course, the chronology is not that important, but I think it is in a way, because if we find it so important and crucial and the only thing required, why to talk about everything else first before talking about Sharanagati? But I have also some explanation to it. It's perhaps because the same pattern I can see in Padyavadi, that Sharanagati is being kept right at the end of the book almost, is that this increases in eagerness for true Sharanagatas to go through all the material, all Siddhanta, all the studies in looking for that Sharanagati. Where's the Sharanagati? And in order to arrive at that Sharanagati, the authors will of main scriptures will guide us through all levels, through all aspects of bhakti, in order to arrive samambhanu and a conclusion, a peak of all Siddhanta, that is Sharanagati. But the same question is not satisfied, because this statement is not satisfied, because then you have different Kartapadas writing about Sharanagati as a separate book, as a supplementary. So looks to me not the main thing. So can you just brief on that?
I'm not sure if I'm following everything, but one thing regarding the Sindhu and the presentation of Sharanagati in the Sindhu, another thing to consider is that prior to the mention of the 64 angas, there is mention of the adhikar for sadhana bhakti. And the adhikar subject is discussed in detail, and the adhikari is said to be the person with shraddha. So if we look in the Bhakti Sandarbha, in the section where Jiva Goswami discusses shraddha, it's there that he says Sacha Sharanabhati Lakshana, that Sharanagati is a lakshana of shraddha.
Yeah.
So you can also understand it that by Rupa Goswami initially speaking of shraddha prior to talking about any sadhana bhakti angas, the implication is already that one will be a Sharanagata before doing those things.
Got it.
Because if you have shraddha, you have Sharanagati. So if you to be an adhikari, you need to be a shraddhavan person, then that implies that you're a Sharanagata. So then you would say, well, then why does he mention it again in the 64 angas if it's implied in the adhikar? So you can take it in the sense that when he's mentioning it again in the list of 64, that there it's that what's as it's described here, just that act of conceiving of oneself to belong to Bhagavan, or making that affirmation of Bhagavan being one's protector, that is also an act of bhakti, or that is also one such way of bhakti being expressed. So it's befitting to include it in the list as it is in Anga, and it's also understandably implied in the adhikar, in the fundamental position as well. And then from Sanatana Goswami's analysis, Jiva Goswami's analysis, that becomes all the more explicitly discussed.
Okay.
So if we look at it that way, then, I don't know exactly who you're talking about, but, classically, writers like in the Mukunda Mala Stotra of Kulashekar Alwar, or the Stotaratna of Yamunacharya, or, in those kind of classical Vaishnava poetry, the, spirit and the concept of Sharanagati is abundantly pervasive, So I'm not really acquainted with any literature where it's sort of described as a secondary or an alternative means. It seems quite, widely understood and pervasively understood to be quite central.
Or maybe my observations based on, single books that maybe be published for one's own, benefit. I don't know. It's possible that some modern writers write things. By modern, I mean like last 100 years, maybe 200, writing about Sharanagati specifically just for their own nourishment or just, expansion of for their own benefit, basically. But yeah, you're right. I don't have in mind many examples of such books. Okay, thank you for that.
Maybe you are referring to a book of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who was writing this.
But yeah, one of the Caitanya-caritamrta Goswami, he wrote about Nam. He wrote something Shana specifically, but I'm not sure. So, Caitanya-caritamrta Goswami. And maybe the Krishna Das Babaji may suggest, explain or confirm that. Did Caitanya-caritamrta Goswami? Okay.
Sorry, it looks like my connection's a little bit weak right now, so I didn't make out everything that was just said. Something about Caitanya-caritamrta Goswami's writing, but I didn't make out the whole statement.
Okay. What I was, I was suggested that did I refer this to Sharanagati book written by Bhaktivinoda Thakur? I said yes, it's one of them. I said, but I believe there's some other Padakartas like Caitanya-caritamrta Goswami. Did he write anything about Sharanagati specifically? Because I know he wrote a lot of books about Nam, but
not that I recall.
I'm not sure if he did. It was my impression that he wrote something about Sharanagati specifically.
Maybe in the Bhakti Rahasya Kanika he might have an article, but none of his books are titled that way or as a central theme that I recall.
Oh, I see. Title, okay. Do you know of any authors writing specifically about Sharanagati that you might recall in the past? Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I heard. I mean.
Oh, just sorry.
No, I can't think of. I can't think of any.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry. Someone want to ask a question?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, you was quoting. You were saying that. Yes, please. Vaikuntha Pranam Babaji.
Okay, fair enough.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, I hear you. It may be a little broken up, but I hear you.
Are you hearing me? Connection is very bad. Okay. Can you tell me? You said that Jiva Goswami was commenting on the Sudachara, Apichetsudarachara verse. Can you give me the precise place where we can find this comment?
He cites that verse quite a number of times in the Sandarbhas. So was there a particular context that you were thinking of?
You was saying that you were saying about his specific comments. I don't remember exactly what you said, but I'm interested about knowing what was. Yes, you said that the devotees who is saying this verse is not is having Lokik Shraddha.
Yes.
So where he said that?
Okay, that I can give you. Just a sec. Just a moment. Okay, here it is. This is... Okay. This is Bhakti Sandarbha 173. I put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, he makes a few comments about this verse in various places, so some of the points I referred to are elsewhere, but the part about it being what he calls loka parampara prapta, the shraddha of this person is, loka parampara prapta, or it's gotten from folk tradition, natu shastra avadharana jata. It's not produced by ascertainment or understanding of the shastra. All right, so shall we conclude here for today? Is that all right?
Thank you.
All right. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam. So next